There we go. Well, hi everyone and good morning and welcome to Farming for Carbon and Nature, our biodiversity monitoring training. Like I just said, this is all part of our fantastic volunteer opportunity and experiences. So thank you so much for making some time today to come hang out and see what we do. So just a little bit of housekeeping. Please make sure to keep your microphone muted if you're not speaking, and if you feel comfortable, we would love to see all of your beautiful faces. The session is being recorded, so we will be able to share it again if that's something that you need, and it will be distributed to students who might not have been able to come to today's training as well. Like both Celine and myself have already said, please ensure that your Zoom profile is displaying your full name. We are going to be taking attendance today. And you can do that by clicking the three little dots at the top right of your screen. We would love to hear all of your questions, so please make sure that you use the chat, the chat box, or raise your hand if you have anything that you want to ask or discuss further. And yeah, thank you so much for those who have introduced yourself. For anyone else, feel free to continue introducing yourself just so we can all get to know each other, because there's a chance that we'll all be working together later this year. So, like I said, my name is Jacqueline. I'm with my fantastic colleagues, Celine. We are project managers of SOS UK that work on food and farming, which is what we're here to talk to you about today. So what we're going to go over today is what we do at SOS UK and who we are, why you're here, climate, nature, and farming, an introduction to farming for carbon and nature as a pilot project, biodiversity monitoring and the survey methods that we'll be using, earthworms, and we will also be getting onto mammals today. And also training feedback before we wrap up. And like Celine said, probably before 12:30. So the objectives for today, by the end of today, we are hoping that you will be able to describe the aims of SOS UK and our FCN pilot project. That is a really important thing to note. Like, this project is still pretty new for us. So the more involvement that we get from folks like yourself, the more successful that it's going to be, and the likelier it is that we'll be able to continue it. We want to see you guys outline how farming in the UK can have a positive impact on the climate crisis. We'd like to see you guys outline how farming in the UK can have a positive impact on biodiversity, which is a lot of why we're here today. We'd like to see you guys define the purpose of biodiversity monitoring within the pilot project. We're going to be explaining how you'll be carrying out biodiversity monitoring activities and what's going to happen with the data that you collect. So, who are we? Great question. SOS UK is a nationwide climate education charity that launched in October of 2019. We work to engage, inspire, and empower students to learn, act, and lead for environmental justice. In addition to Farming for Carbon and Nature, we run a whole series of programs that work with students who have just gotten to residence, or we work with institutional levels as well. So we really want to cover all of our bases with folks that we are giving climate education to. We want to make sure that when students start university, to the time that they graduate, they are equipped with all of the tools and resources that they need to be making smart decisions when it comes to their participation with the environment, but also provide a lot of opportunities like this so people can also get involved. So like I said, we run a whole series of different projects. For folks who might have lived in residence, you might have heard of our Student Switch Off program, which is down here at the bottom right. Some of you might have heard of Green Impact if you're at the more institutional level as well. But yeah, if there are any other projects that you're interested in hearing more about later, feel free to reach out to one of us at Farming for Carbon and Nature, and we'd be happy to help you out. So you are all probably quite well aware that we are in a climate emergency, and there are all sorts of different ways to get involved and help. So how can farming help? Based on 2030 government targets, there's a 95% probability of exceeding 1.5 that was outlined in the Paris Agreement in 2015. We really want to make sure that we do not exceed this limit. It would be hugely disastrous with many, many consequences. And we want to make sure that at every facet of our lives and in every place that we can make a difference, that we are doing so. Our safe limit is a limit that is at the pre-industrial, in comparison to the pre-industrial level, that won't have significant consequences on all sorts of different areas of our climate and biodiversity. So as you can see at the 2.5 degree level, we really do see massive, massive increases or massive breaches of our safe limit rather than maybe the 0.5 or the 1 degree above pre-industrial. We really want to make sure again that we are not exceeding 1.5. So the biodiversity crisis is the rapid loss of species and the rapid degradation of ecosystems. So ecosystems and species are related, but they're not the same. And at the moment, globally, more than 1 million animals and plant species are threatened with extinction. And a lot of these animals and species live on our farms. You know, they live on the land that we use in our day-to-day. So we have risks to our amphibians, to our conifers, that's kind of plant, coral reefs, our ocean life, mammals, and birds as well. And so you might be thinking, oh, we might be monitoring some birds. That's where all of this is coming together. So why is all of this important? We need to make sure that we're meeting basic human needs, including our food, water, fuel, and shelter. Healthy agricultural soils for food production is a really important thing to have in order to have the food that we eat. Across the world, we are experiencing factory farming, monocrops, and all of these things that don't necessarily contribute to healthy biodiversity or genetic diversity for our future food crops. When you continue planting the same food sources like every single season, you start to degrade the soil and erode it. That's why we need to be constantly moving our food over. And we can't live without food. We can't live without our agriculture. It's important for every other part of our life because that's what's going to keep us going. And food is so important for culture. It's so important for art, religion, leisure. I mean, who of us had breakfast this morning? Like, that's how important it is to our day-to-day life. But agriculture has a really big impact on the climate and biodiversity crises, but UK statistics don't necessarily reflect global statistics. So worldwide, 50% of our planet's habitable land is farmed. That is so much land. We need to make sure that we are protecting this. We need to make sure that we're not forcing species out of their habitats. We're really needing to make sure that we are taking care of the land that we have. Global food and farming is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss, water use, and soil degradation. So that's what I was talking about when we're having the same crops over and over. But you might be thinking of some examples. So like palm oil plantations, maybe in Brazil, as one example of where this biodiversity loss is happening. There's a really great BBC documentary where you have an older orangutan that is followed around, and it's in, or maybe not an orangutan, some kind of monkey, in a forest in Brazil, and you can see throughout its life like how much its world is being impacted, how small its world is getting while this habitable land is being taken away. So when we're talking about biodiversity loss, that's what we mean. We're also looking at the kinds of plants that are available. If you have one plant and that is it, you're not giving other species the ability to thrive. The agricultural industry overall is responsible for 34% of global emissions, which is an insane amount. A lot of this comes from deforestation. It comes from how we're harvesting, it's how we're farming, from pesticides or the lack thereof, to how we are manufacturing them and producing them and sending them out. Because when we have such a global economy now, we are also exporting all of our food around the world, and that's how all of these emissions are calculated. However, what about the UK? 70% of the UK is farmed, and this is one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. Between 50 years ago and now, our wildlife here has declined by 69%, and that has a lot to do with the intensification of our agriculture. Agriculture overall is responsible for 10% of the UK emissions, and when you're looking at a global average of 34%, that is quite significant as well. And that is why, you know, when we're looking at how nature depleted the country that we all live in at the moment is, we do need to be really mindful of what kinds of actions we can take to help change that future. So, what can farming do? Farming can actually cool the planet. We want to make sure that, we want to make sure that if we have all of this fertile land, we're not necessarily just using it for food sources, but we're using it in a way that can store carbon, you know, in forests, wetlands, and meadows. We want to make sure that we're working with, not against landscapes, and with farmers that can restore the ecosystems. Since 70% of the UK is covered by farmland and 10% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions are from agriculture, we need to continue to support different methods to reduce this impact. The National Farmers Union have committed to net zero across England and Wales by 2040, and that is where SOS steps in with this in mind. Sorry, 35,000 hectares of fertile land are owned by colleges and universities. And so when you have all of these different net zero policies that are mostly compatible with each other, we do want to make sure that we're helping to source as much information and collect as much information as we can to make a really good decision. So I hope all of that made a lot of sense. But what we're going to talk about now is the Farming for Carbon and Nature pilot project. So we work with 10 farms and universities across the UK to support, farming for better soil health, to reduce GHG emissions, and to help nature and support recovery while increasing biodiversity. So that's why we're getting you guys out on the farm so we can collect all of this data about nature and climate and farming. We are going to be collecting and analyzing soil and also biodiversity data. So I know today it's training is mostly biodiversity related, but maybe you guys will be a little bit more interested in helping us with soil as well later. So we want to encourage universities and colleges to support farms on their land to adopt practices that are positive for soil health and nature. But because all of these have to work together, we also want to encourage the universities to really do everything that they can to accommodate agriculture workers and to make these really good decisions, since this land is being rented out on what we call tenant farms. So if everything goes well, which it will with all of your help, we are going to properly launch this new SOS UK program sometime next year. So what we do with the information from our soil and the information from our biodiversity, we send this off to our advisory group. We have a nice conversation and we figure out what to do from there. The farms that we have worked with previously are highlighted on this map. I know that I see a lot of folks from the University of Lincoln today, so you guys are one of our longer term supporters, and we are going to continue working with all sorts of farms across the UK as well this year. So I know I just threw a lot at you there. Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask myself or Celine? I'm going to take that as a no for right now, but if anybody has any questions, feel free to pass them back to us at any point today. And either in the chat box, one of us is going to answer, and you will get our contact information by the end of today. If you have the Zoom link, you should have gotten it already. So if something occurs to you later, please let us know. But yeah, we are going to take a really short break at the moment. I think Celine said about 10 minutes. Yeah, we'll do that. Okay, amazing. So I am going, yeah. So if everybody just wants to take 10 minutes, go right ahead.
Okay, if we come back at about 10:30, I think that's fine.
Yeah. It's gonna pause now.
The project, a little bit about obviously the sort of background of farming and why we need to make it more climate sort of sustainable. So now I'm going to talk about the actual survey methods that you'll be doing out on the farm in Lincoln. So the first section we'll talk about is an overview of the FCN biodiversity monitoring. So just a bit of an overview of what the sort of data you're collecting is, why it's important and where it's going. So we've got 2 rounds of sort of survey periods for this project. So the first one is generally March, April, might sort of be April, May, depending obviously on the timeline of your university. But generally around April time, we've got a few different surveys we want all the universities to do. So first one is earthworm counts. So we'll teach you this method shortly. So that's all about counting earthworms, seeing how many are in each area of soil that you sample. The second one is the big farmland bird count. So this is looking at what bird species are on the farm that you're surveying. So looking at what sort of birds are present. And the final one is optional, but this is looking at mammal tracks and signs, so seeing what mammal species are around on the farm again. So that's the sort of 3 survey periods we have at this time of year, so earthworms, birds, and worms. So that's what we're covering today, mammals, sorry. In May, June, a little bit later in the term, so hopefully if you're interested in taking part again, we do have some other surveys that we ask all the FCN farms to do. So this is the Great British Hedgerow Survey, which looks at hedgerow health, looking at how healthy the hedgerows are, how many species are in the hedgerows, and how can they be improved. And our second one is flying insects. So this is looking at pollinators, so things like bumblebees, bees, hoverflies, butterflies, etc. So that's the sort of second round. And we do that a bit later in summer because obviously as it gets warmer, we get a lot more insects. So these are our sort of rounds of survey periods. So the first lot that you'll be doing in Lincoln in the coming month or so, I guess, will be the earthworms, birds, and mammals. So your data, all the data you collect through this project is not just part of this project, it also goes towards national records, which is really great. So everything that you collect through this project will go towards helping to understand where species are, where they're not present, and also the quality of habitat and ecosystems. So for example, for our birds, we upload all the records to iRecord, which is the national database internationally used to record various species. For the mammals, we have Mammal Society records, which go to the NBN Atlas. So all these records basically get passed into a bigger atlas of species records. And anyone who's doing a national study, for example, for their PhD, for undergraduate, can access a lot of the records from iRecord for free. So it's a really, really great database that scientists can use to access much larger data set than they can collect themselves, because across the UK, lots of people are logging their sightings, and it means there's this nice free database that everyone can use. With the insects, we contribute all the data from this project to the POMS, which is the UK Pollinator Monitoring Scheme. And this is looking at the sort of health of pollinators across the UK, how many sort of pollinators are abundant in different areas, looking at the decline as well. So it's super important because obviously, as lots of you might know, we've lost a lot of our insects in the last sort of 50 years. So it's really important to monitor what's happening to their populations. And finally, the People's Trust for Endangered Species collects all our hedgerow data we send them. So again, all the data you take through this project will go towards larger records and be used by citizen science, hopefully, and other sort of recording things in the future. So it's really important to obviously upload your records because apart from this project, it also has a bigger impact elsewhere. And if any of you are looking to do some larger pieces of work, I really recommend having a look at iRecord. They have loads and loads of data that you can get from the NBN Atlas. So it's really useful if you're trying to get a big data set, for example, to see what time of year flowers are flowering or how many species of hoverfly are in the UK. All this sort of data is available on these big atlases. So specifically about Farming for Carbon Nature now, which is the project that you're taking part in. So the first survey that you'll be doing is the Farmland Bird Survey. So why are we surveying for birds? So birds have been really well studied over the centuries. So the distribution, abundance, and sort of habitat preference is really well recorded. So birds are generally a species that we know a lot about. They're quite easy to detect and observe. They're quite easy to sort of see flying about in daytime, so they're quite easy to find. And have cues that can alert us to their presence. So things like bird calls, bright coloured feathers, nests, etc. Another thing that helps is that most bird species are active during the daytime, which makes it a lot easier to find them than it does mammals, because obviously birds are out and about in daytime, so we can obviously record them when we go to the farms. Another super important thing is that birds sit near the top of the food chain. So they're a really great indicator of how the rest of the food chain is doing. So if the birds are in trouble, you generally know that other species are in trouble too, because birds rely on things like insects and seeds from flowers. So generally, if the bird population is starting to decline, you can usually guess that something is happening lower down in the food chain as well. Birds are also really sensitive to environmental contaminants. So things like pesticides, chemicals that we spray on the farm landscape, all the concentration of that builds up in insect populations, which then birds eat. So generally, birds tend to be much more affected by these contaminants. So any sort of animals near the top of the food chain are a really good indicator of how the rest of the food chain is doing. And birds are particularly important for this. So in the UK, they're a really important indicator of how the farmland health is doing, you know, sort of an indicator of how good the habitats are, how good the rest of the food chain is, and how many chemicals are being used as well. So that's why we like to look at farmland birds as part of this project. So unfortunately, as I sort of already mentioned briefly, birds are really not doing well. There's a lot of reasons for this. So they are declining in all habitats across the UK, but unfortunately farmland birds are doing the worst. So farmland covers a huge area of the UK. Around 70% of our UK landmass is farmland, which is obviously a huge part of our area. In comparison, trees only cover 13% of the UK. So if you can think about how much the land is covered by farmland, it's obviously a huge, huge part of the landscape. So we have been monitoring specific bird species indicators since 1970. I can see there's been a significant decline in birds across all habitat types in the UK. But the biggest decline has been in the 19 species of farmland birds that has been monitored in this time. So you can see on the screen here a couple in the middle of different examples of bird species that are specialist to farmland. So the tree sparrow, for example, is a species that's a good indicator. They've dropped by 93%, between 1970 and 2008. Corn crakes and stone curlews have declined massively as well. Things like the grey partridge has decreased by 70% between 1970 and 2008. And a few other species like corn bunting, turtle dove, and yellow wagtail, which are all farmland specialists, have also declined. So you can see on the screen here, on the left-hand side, you have this graph. So you can see across the UK in this time, from 1970 to 2008, all the different bird species generally started to go down, unfortunately, in population, but the farmland birds, which is the line in red, has particularly declined really drastically. So you can see they've had a huge decline compared to a lot of other species. So this is obviously super worrying, and part of the reason we try to monitor bird populations through this project, because birds, unfortunately, are declining massively in farmland areas. There are various types of birds that live in farmland. So generalist birds are ones that can live across lots of habitats. So these are things like starlings, kestrels, and other birds. They can essentially live in urban areas, in farmland and forest. But other birds, for example, the ones on screen, are very much specialist to field areas, which is why they rely on farmland areas to be actually a good population. So unfortunately, yeah, the news is that bird species are not doing well across the UK. So a quick question to all of you, if you can just put in the chat box any ideas. So have a little think and share in the chat box. How do you think changes in land use and the way we farm is affecting our bird populations? So essentially, why do you think farmland birds are declining so much? I'll give you all a few minutes to have a think and type some ideas in the chat box. Give you all a little bit more time. I can see you've got an answer coming in. That's great. So any ideas at all of why you think bird populations are declining in our farmland areas, or how our farm and sort of land use changes have actually affected birds? Great. If you've got any more ideas, feel free to keep adding them to chat box. I can see Roshana put intensive monoculturing, high use of pesticides and mechanization. Absolutely, yes. Obviously, transform the landscape into very much one crop. Monoculturing is a big problem. It means there's only one sort of food source available. High use of pesticides. So exactly like I said, the food chain is impacted by pesticides. So if all the insects are obviously getting sprayed and all the plants as well, this obviously goes up the food chain and unfortunately affects the birds' populations. Mechanization, yep, so lots of farm mechanisms, so things like tractors, big sort of mechanical things that obviously might kill and impact birds as well, and also destroy the habitat. I think so Celia, sorry if I pronounced it wrong, said habitat destruction and source of food is impacted by climate change. So yeah, definitely habitat destruction and food has obviously been impacted by changes in climate, changes in weather patterns. Hafiza said temperature is also a factor. Yeah, so all of these factors unfortunately come together. So there's a mix of changing sort of intensity of the landscape, also a mix of climate change, habitat destruction. So all of these things are particularly badly hitting our farm and birds. So the decline is very much linked to intensification and expansion of agriculture, like a few of you mentioned. So overall, for farmland birds, the quality and the quantity of habitats for birds has decreased. So there's less food sources and nesting sites than there used to be. So if you think about how we used to farm perhaps in the 50s compared to how we farm now, it's very different. We have a lot more intensive farming, a lot more large landscape farming, and obviously there's a lot less habitat and food available for wildlife, including birds. So firstly, large field sizes and little variety in crops, so monoculture, as one of you mentioned. This means there's a lot less variety in things to eat, less seeds available, and just not much. The landscape is basically just one type of plant for miles. Increased pesticide use is a big problem. So this directly impacts invertebrate numbers. As I said, it goes into the food chain, it impacts the bottom of the food chain the most. But as it goes up the food chain, it then kills off other things at the top. So things like birds, mammals, they all end up eating all these sort of insects and plants that have been sprayed. And obviously that builds up in their food system and can poison them. There's also a lot more frequent mowing of grassland areas. So a lot of farms are quite aggressive with how they sort of do their mowing. It can be quite frequent and it negatively impacts the ground nesting birds that want to nest along grass. So again, there's a lot less nesting habitat available. And finally, removal of hedgerows, trees and margin habitats. So if you think about how farms might have been quite small and had lots of hedgerows, now we tend to have really, really big fields with much less hedgerows than they used to be. And this loss of this habitat is unfortunately impacting a lot of species, including birds. There's less habitat and it's more fragmented. Sadly, there's lots of reasons why farming is obviously impacting our bird species across the UK quite negatively. So obviously we're aware of this decline in numbers. We're trying to monitor bird species across the UK for this reason. So the survey that you'll be doing is based on the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust method. Essentially, this runs each year and it basically helps farmers assess how their farming practices might be helping or harming the farmland birds in their farm, and also all the other wildlife that lives there. This survey also gives farmers an awareness of which species are present on their land, which then means they can focus on how to support them. So for example, if they realise there's a specifically rare bird species on the farm, they might be able to install some nest boxes, some extra food, some ways that they can leave some land for these species. So it's really important to know what's on the farm so the farmers can make some improvements. So you can see here on the screen from last year, all the stats from this big farmland bird count. They had over 1,700 farmers taking part last year, 149 bird species recorded, and lots of different areas of the UK were taking part. So we had 1.5 million acres of land included, and they found some great species, including 33 that were on the red list, which is the sort of threatened list of species. So when you go out and do the survey on the farm, it's really important to record obviously any birds you see, and we do then feed this back to the farms so they've got an idea of what bird species you found in their land. So how to actually do the big farmland bird count. This might be the first time some of you have done bird watching, so we'll go through some steps of how to do it. So equipment for the day, I believe Lincoln, the staff should already have the equipment, I believe. So binoculars, we suggest generally one per pair of students is great. So having some binoculars. This means you can see much further away. You can sort of scan the landscape and see what bird species are flying or landing in different areas. We also suggest having a copy of the big farmland bird count record sheet, which we'll share with you. Pen or pencil, the ID sheet, so you can actually see what sort of bird species you're looking for, and also a wild bird book if possible, just for any other species that are not on the list that you might want to ID. So I believe Lincoln, because I took part in FCN last year, I think already has all the equipment, but yeah, we'll be sending that to your tutors and staff if not. So first step before the day that you go out on the farm is to look over the bird ID sheet and get familiar. So start looking at the different birds and get a bit familiar with what's actually on the sheet. So firstly, ask yourself, do you recognise any of these species? Have you seen any of them before? That will hopefully help you pick out the ones that you're quite familiar with. If there's some that you don't know, definitely do familiarise yourself. So the ID sheet has a mix of some of the most common farmland birds you are likely to see, as well as a few rarer ones that are of conservation importance. So there's a few species on here that potentially you'd be quite lucky to see, but it's nice to obviously get familiar with the ID in case you do see them. So make sure you have a good look for the ID sheet beforehand. Pay attention to feathers, beak shapes and size when you're doing recording. So when you're looking for binoculars, make sure you have a clear look at sort of size of the bird, sort of any patterns on it, any colours that you can distinguish. And also note that female and male birds can look very different. So this adds a bit of extra complication because the males can look quite different to the females. So your tutor or staff member on hand should have a bird book on the day or when you do the visit. So there are other bird species you might see that are not on this list. And obviously you can refer to the bird book if there's any that you're not sure of. So if you have internet access on the day, you can also have a handy guide on your phone, which is the RSCB bird guide. So we do welcome, if you want to use this obviously on the day to ID some birds, you definitely can do. But either way, your tutor or member of staff should have a nice bird book and a bit of an idea of bird species ID as well. So step 2 is to work out with your tutor a place to choose to count the birds. So we generally recommend somewhere on the farm that has a good view of around 2 hectares of the farming ideal. So you can see quite far away, you can see across the field, as you can see in the picture here. Anywhere that's a bit higher, so on a small hill or slightly raised area of grass is essentially best. It means that you can see a bit further. It means you've got a good view of the land around you. So if you can find a hill or raised area, definitely do use that. To see the highest number of birds, we recommend that the site includes potentially an area of game or wild seed mix. So if there is anywhere the farmer's already feeding birds, it's obviously useful to make sure you use that area because there'll probably be more birds there. If there isn't, that's fine. But if the Lincoln farm does have anywhere that you're feeding birds, it's definitely worth going there. So there's a few tips here for how to do it. We would also suggest that it's probably best to do the bird survey first thing. So when you first go to the farm, do it earlier in the day because birds tend to be more active in the morning, especially when they're looking for food after the night. So doing it first thing in your visit is definitely best. So step 3 is to record details about the local area conditions. So before you start your survey, make sure you record your name. So if you're working in a pair, make sure you record both your names. The farm naming grid reference, so make sure you put that clearly on there. So one grid reference is fine for the whole group because obviously you're going to be going out together. So you can just use one grid reference and you can use the OS grid reference app to make sure that you know which location you're in. Make sure you record the count time. So what time of day it is. As I said, morning is generally better. Record the weather on the record date. So is it clear and sunny, frosty, snowy, rain, etc. This just helps get an idea of sort of abundance of birds because obviously weather does impact how many birds you're likely to see as well. And you can also record on the sheet any features near you in the survey area. So for example, any hedgerows, woodland, ponds, grass margins, etc. Make sure you tick on that sheet if there are any near you. So generally we suggest doing a 30-minute count. So spending 30 minutes counting any birds that you see, obviously using binoculars, making sure you're scanning the landscape. So around 30 minutes is best. So we do have a video here. It's always very temperamental. So if it doesn't play, I might just have to go onto YouTube to watch it instead. So let's see if it decides to do that. So give me 1 second. I might stop sharing for a sec and then share on the screen for a minute. So this will just show you how to use your binoculars. So if you're not sure, have done binoculars or any sort of used them before, this just gives you a very short little intro of how to actually use them. So I think it's in here. Hopefully that's displaying okay for everyone. Jacqueline, can you just let me know if you can see the screen? Is this fine?
Yeah, I can see the screen.
Perfect. So here's the little video. It'll just show you how to set them up and how to use them.
If you're picking up binoculars for the first time, there are a couple things you might want to think about before you even look at a bird. First, check to make sure that the distance between the barrels lines up with your eyes. You're shooting for one circular image when you look through the lenses. Next, take a look at the eye cups. If you're wearing glasses, you'll want the eye cups rolled down. If you don't wear glasses, keep them rolled up. One last thing that can cause trouble is the diopter. It's a feature to help compensate for the differences between your eyes, but if it's not set correctly, you're not going to get the clear view you're looking for. Find the diopter adjustment, usually near the right eye cup. You can either make sure it's in the center or set it for your eyes. Set the diopter by covering the right eye and turning the focus wheel so that your left eye is focused on a fixed object. Make sure it's nice and sharp. Then cover your left eye and look at the same object through the right eye. If it's not sharp, adjust the right eye with the diopter accordingly. And you're set. From that point forward, you will not need to make this adjustment again. Make note of where you set it in case it gets moved out of place. When you spot a bird, keep looking at it and lift the binoculars to your eyes. Then turn the focus wheel until the image becomes clear. It's not a bad idea to practice this a few times, even if you aren't looking at a bird. Scanning is another great way to find birds. Even if you don't already see a bird, you can use your binoculars to help. Let's say you're searching a lake for water birds. Lift your binoculars and focus them on the horizon or the far side of the lake. Then slowly pan across the landscape. But be ready for the unexpected bird to pop up. You want to be able to dial that focus in quickly and enjoy the view. A good pair of binoculars is your most important tool for spotting birds. So find a pair you like and take them with you on your next adventure.
I'll pause there. A lot of you, if you have used binoculars before, sorry, that was probably quite basic for you, but if you haven't, I think it's quite helpful just to do a quick run through of how to actually set them up. Cool, so I get back to my slides now. Give me 1 second. Cool, so hopefully that's working for you again now. So you've had a bit of an idea of how to set up the binoculars if you haven't done it before. So as I said, it's about a 30-minute count. So make sure you spend around 30 minutes as a group looking for and recording any birds you see on the farm. So use your binoculars to scan the landscape, as the video mentioned, making sure you're sort of scanning around. There are 59 species listed in the Big Farm and Bird Count, so a lot of different birds to look for, but 32 of these are on the ID sheet, so definitely use that as your main base. That's the ones you're most likely to see. Any other birds can be found in the bird ID book if you're not sure. Use the tips of the video to help you locate birds and also listen out for calls. And work with your partner, I think usually you work in pairs for this, to match the birds you see to the pictures in the ID sheet. For each species you see, make a tally of how many individuals you can see at the same time. So obviously if you see a flock, for example, of 10 seagulls, make sure you count all 10 birds individually that you've seen. Remember that any loud noises will scare birds close to you, so try to be as quiet as possible. Ideally quieten down as a group for several minutes before you actually start doing the count. So if you get there 10 minutes early, potentially have a bit of quiet time and then start counting 10 minutes in, that'll probably mean you're more likely to see some birds because they've got used to you being in the landscape, but they're not quite so scared, more likely to come out. So make sure you have that time as well as possible. Yeah, keeping quiet is the key. Once you're finished recording all your birds as a group, make sure that once you're back in the classroom or at some point over lunch in the daytime, that you record all the species you've seen. So essentially choose the highest recorded count for each species. So if you've been working in pairs and someone recorded 5 chaffinches and someone recorded 6, someone else had 7, record the highest total number. So that would just be 7 in this case. So whoever had the highest number they could see individually, make sure you record that for each species. Note these down on a new record sheet or an Excel spreadsheet. So you can see here, we've got some instructions on the screen. You can see how to use the platform. And I think our colleagues will be sending you a sort of detailed breakdown of how to actually upload your record. So generally we suggest if you're working in a group of 10 people, just one pair can potentially do the uploading of the survey data to iRecord on behalf of everyone else. Your tutor will have written instructions about how to access the website and link your birdwatching data to the project. There are 2 tabs to complete, so one for bird species spotted and the other one for location details. So bird species spotted is obviously listing all the sort of birds you've seen and how many. And location details will be which farm it is, sort of what area, what habitats around it. So again, all this data will go apart from to our project. It also goes to the national research. So it's super important. So any questions about the bird surveying? Does that all make sense? Or does anyone have any questions they're not sure about? Again, feel free just to add in the chat box if you're not sure. If not, hopefully that was reasonably clear, which is good. So we're going to do a little bird quiz now, just to make sure that you're having a bit of an idea of some of the common species. A lot of you, if you're keen and you'll do a lot of bird watching, a lot of nature, you'll probably know these. If you don't know what birds these are, obviously this will be a nice chance to learn. So I'm going to put on the screen now. We've got 14 different birds here. So if you could just by yourself write down on a piece of paper or perhaps on a notepad now, what do you think these bird species are? If you don't know, you can definitely use the RTE website. They've got a really handy guide to have a go at IDing them. So I'll give you all about 5 minutes. If you could just have a go at IDing these bird species, have a look at the RTE website if you're not sure, and obviously write down your answers. So I'll give you all a few minutes and then we'll do a little round of answers for each of these bird species. Jacqueline, would you mind putting the link in the chat for the RTE website if anyone wants to use it for ID? You might recognise some of these species from your campus, from your sort of local area, your park and garden. They're all quite common ones. So I've given you the more easy birds, but have a go and see if you can ID them correctly. Right, I'll give you all another 4 minutes to have a go. If you know the bird species already, you can definitely write down some extra notes, for example, the habitats they live in or what they eat. That's also optional. So if you're well ahead on the ID, feel free to do that. And we'll give you all another, I think, 3 minutes. Right, hopefully you've all had a chance to at least start on those. So if we move on to potentially guessing. So does anyone have an idea of what number 1 is? You can put it in the chat box if you know. If you're not sure, just feel free to put any of the other numbers. So if you guessed any of the numbers correctly, put them in chat. Yeah, number 1 is chaffinch. Thank you, Chloe. Yeah, so number 1 is a chaffinch. So you've got a male and female, which are different, look differently. Number 2, any ideas? Long-tailed tit, yeah, correct. They're very characteristic, one of my favourite birds. You can see big groups of them quite often. They're really cute, and they have a nice sort of pinky colour and a very long tail, as the name suggests. Number 3, a little bit tricky potentially. Any ideas what number 3 might be? Cold tit, yeah, correct. So they essentially sort of have a black and white colour, a little bit different to the other tit species, which are more colourful. So that's cold tit, yeah, perfect. Number 4, you might have seen this one in your garden or your park for sure. Number 4. Yeah, perfect. Collared dove, indeed. So it's got a little distinct collar on its neck, hence the name. Again, quite an easy one to spot. Number 5, this is one you definitely would have seen, hopefully, in your local area. Starling, perfect. I can see, yeah, thanks, Visa. Yep, so starling, again, you often see them in big flocks. There used to be a lot more starlings than there is now. They used to fly around in really huge flocks. they're now declined massively, and they do rely on farmland areas a lot, so they're a particularly important one actually. They might seem quite common, but they have declined a lot compared to where they used to be. So yeah, you might hopefully see those on the farm. Number 6, this is a national favourite, I think. A very colourful bird. Any idea of number 6? Let's see. Yeah, Rolls put goldfinch. Yep, so this is one of the favourite birds. I think a lot of people like these ones. They've got a very distinctive face. Male and female look exactly the same. So if you see that red face and the nice yellow wing, that's goldfinch. Number 7, so it's got the little arrow pointing up. So number 7, any ideas? Again, quite a favourite bird, I'd say. Yeah, blue tit. So a very distinct blue colour. You can see the tits will have that specific sort of black head. They've got quite colourful features generally. So blue tit is one of the blue heads there. Quite a light colour. Number 8, any ideas? A little bit trickier potentially. Yeah, Chloe said greenfinch. That is indeed a greenfinch. So they are quite a sort of nice pistachio green colour. They've got a bit of yellow on the wing as well. And again, male and female look the same. So if you see them, that is exactly the same. So that's greenfinch. Well done. Number 9, similar to the blue tit. Any ideas? Yeah, great tip. So much darker sort of head, generally has sort of black, almost black head markings. A bit similar to the blue tip, but you can see the colours are just generally a bit darker, the darker green, darker blue, and darker yellow. Number 10, this is one that I'm sure you've all seen out and about in parks and gardens. And there's a male and female that look a bit different. Any ideas? Yeah, blackbird. So female is more brown, male is more black, with a yellow beak. Again, quite a common bird you might have seen. Number 11, I think this is one that a lot of people should hopefully recognise. Any guesses? Magpie, perfect. Yeah, so magpie is number 11. Again, farmlands, they're quite opportunistic species. They'll go for any sort of bits of food they can find, so they often are on farmland areas. Number 12. Any ideas? This one's probably quite common. So wood pigeon, perfect. Thank you for that. And then we've got number 13. You've got, again, different male and female. House sparrow is correct. We do also have tree sparrows in the UK, which look a little bit different and have a black dot on the cheek. They're much rarer. So if you do see those on the farm, that's fantastic. But most of you, what you usually see as a sparrow is a house sparrow, which is one you can see on the screen here. Number 14. This is one that I think you might have seen in all Christmas cards. So hopefully everyone knows what this one is. I think I can say this one, it's a robin. It's, yeah, probably one of the most easily identifiable birds there is. Again, male and female looks the same. And finally, number 15. Does anyone know number 15? This is a slightly harder one. Again, very common bird, but you might not realise it. Thank you, Chloe. So that's dunnock. So they look quite similar to sparrows, but have a much sort of paler head, kind of greyish, bluey head, I'd say. They tend to sulk around a lot in bushes, quite low down, whereas sparrows tend to fly out in the open much more. So yeah, a bit of a difference there. But yeah, thanks so much for those answers. I'm glad to see that you've all managed to get at least some of the species correct. So you can see here, we had chaffinch, long-tailed tit, collared dove, starling, goldfinch, blue tit, greenfinch, great tit blackbird, magpie, wood pigeon, house sparrow, and robin. So well done if you got some of those right. It's definitely a bit of practice. Some of you might see these species all the time. For some of you, this might be the first time you've had a go at actually identifying birds. So hopefully that was some good practice. These are the most common species you'll see just in general in the UK, I'd say, in your parks and gardens. So obviously some of the farmland birds you might be seeing will be a little bit different, might be a little bit rarer, but you've got sort of the most common birds on the screen here. So we do have some further reading and resources. If you're interested, we'll send out the slides, I think, after the session. So there is some further reading about birds there if you're interested. So we're now going to have a little break before we go into talking about earthworms and mammals. So if I get you all to do a 10-minute break again, so come back at, let's say, 11:15, and we'll make a start again. Great, so you've learned about how to do the bird survey now, which hopefully was a bit of practice of bird ID. So now next section will be about earthworm survey, so how to actually do the surveys looking at earthworm abundance at the farm. So first question to all of you is to, again, have a little think and then just type any ideas in the chat box. So why do you think earthworms are important? So why do you think we're surveying for them, essentially? Any ideas of what their sort of role is, why they're important? Feel free to add to the chat box. give it a few more seconds. I can see a few answers come in. Yeah, so I can see Hafiz message me directly to say maintaining soil fertility. So yeah, definitely making sure that the soil is fertile. Roshana said natural soil fertilizer organisms. So yeah, they're making essentially linking to that sort of good health of the soil, making sure it's got lots of nutrients in it, absolutely. And we're also soil structure. Yes, this is super important actually with farming. So apart from fertility, the soil needs to have a good structure as well. So earthworms are all really important for these reasons. So this is the reason we're obviously surveying for earthworms as part of this project, is to make sure that the soil is healthy. If you have healthy soil, you have a healthy farm. So they are super important in terms of being, basically a key part of that soil health. So earthworms are really amazing. They might sort of be seen as a bit of a, an animal that no one really likes that much, but they're actually super, super important to the global production of food and to our daily lives. So they are super important, and they have different jobs, essentially. So different earthworm species have different sort of roles in the ecosystem. So earthworms, as some of you might know, are generally a sort of recycler style animal. So they tend to recycle and basically turn the soil into something with more nutrition. So they essentially turn things like dead vegetation into plant foods by breaking it down, making sure it's actually broken down into the soil, and then provide food for the plants that are growing again. They're a bit like tiny ploughs, so essentially have their own little farming role. They take vegetation from the top of the surface down into the soil deeper down, and then deposit the soil on top as well. So essentially they sort of have a nice cycle of food going up and down the soil via the earthworms. This means that any plants that are growing there have more food because there's more sort of nutrition near the roots that are deposited by the earthworms. And as I said, it mentions different species have different roles. So different types of earthworms will live in different parts of the soil and have different roles in terms of decomposition and breaking down nutrients. In many ways, earthworms are civil engineers of the soil. They provide sort of gaps for air to get into the soil. They provide ways for drainage. So as I think Raoul mentioned, soil structure is really linked to earthworms. They are really important to maintaining a good, healthy soil structure for plants to grow in them. So essentially, earthworms are a keystone species. If you haven't heard of the word keystone, essentially it means an animal or sort of species of plant or animal that essentially is really important to the whole ecosystem. So without them, the ecosystem might collapse. So earthworms, absolutely. Without earthworms, the world would not be able to thrive the way it currently does. So any sort of good, healthy farm landscape should have lots of earthworms, lots of this sort of natural fertilizing and breaking down of soil happening. So a less healthy farm will have fewer earthworms and therefore definitely have less soil health. So they are super important to this picture. They have so many different important jobs, as I mentioned, in terms of keeping that soil ecosystem really healthy. They're also really visible, so they're quite easy to survey compared to some other animals. So we can actually survey for earthworms. Things like fungi and other things, microorganisms, are really hard to survey, whereas earthworms obviously are large enough that we can count them and see them physically. So it's quite easy to look at how they change over time and how the sort of abundance of earthworms changes in a farm over several years of management. Surveying for earthworms is best done in spring and autumn because earthworms like to have it quite damp and cool. So middle of the summer when it's really hot, it's not a good time to be looking for earthworms. Likewise, if you look in the middle of winter when the ground is frozen, also not a good time. So generally we say spring and autumn is the best time to look for them. They tend to avoid high soil temperatures and dry soil. So if it's a hot summer, they'll go quite deep into the soil, which makes it quite hard for us to find them. So definitely easy to find them in spring and autumn when it's nice and wet, as it currently has been. So step by step of how to actually do the soil, the earthworm counting. There's a really little handy video here, but again, YouTube, I don't think will want to play on my PowerPoint. So I'm going to have to pause screen sharing and reshare. So give me 1 second. I will just get out of this. It's always very annoying when your slides don't want to actually share the video. So give me 1 sec. So this video essentially will show you sort of step by step how to actually do the earthworm survey. So I will just get my screen share up and running. So here you go, this should now work. So Jackie Stroud is a really, really cool soil scientist fellow. I would definitely recommend reading up her paper. She's published loads and loads of important research papers about soil health and earthworms. She's really great. So her little video here will show you essentially how to do the earthworm count step by step. So I'll go back a tiny bit just to let you.
So everything I have here is what you need to do 60-minute worms. I've got the booklet and a pen. I've got a fork to dig the soil pits, and I use a fork because you chop less worms in half and thus get better worm counts. The size of the pit we're aiming for is 20 centimetres, so I have a ruler and I use a trowel for fine tuning. Then when I'm sorting through the soil that I've got from my pit, I put all the worms into a pot with a lid to stop them escaping. And then when it comes to identification, a little bit of water can be helpful just to rinse the worms and help with ID. Now, optional extras include an e-pad for comfort, and I always like to have a timer and only spend 5 minutes sorting through the soil to find the earthworms in order to achieve 10 soil pits in an hour.
Found 11 worms in this pit. No worm has a saddle, so no further measurements are recorded from this pit. 21 worms in this soil pit, and separated the adults from the juveniles. Now these are the juveniles and they have no saddle. So although you can get some quite large earthworms, size doesn't mean it's an adult. What we're looking for is the presence of a saddle. Small red worms with a distinctive saddle are recorded as type 1 epigeic. They're litter dwelling and their important roles are in carbon cycling and food for native birds. Green or pale worms with a distinctive saddle are recorded as type 2 endogeic. They're topsoil dwelling earthworms with a distinctive saddle near the head, and these are the two most common species found in arable fields, usually quite abundant. And they have important roles in aggregating the soil and nutrient mobilisation for plants. Large dark worms with a distinctive saddle are recorded as type 3 anisic. These large worms play important roles in forming deep burrows for plant roots and water infiltration, and their saddle is found near the head.
And we'll be talking to Jackie Stroud.
Was it there? But that's gives you a bit of an idea of how the sort of different worms are mentioned as different species. So obviously they all have a very important role to play in the different parts of the soil. I'll go back to the slides now just to show you the rest of the actual methods. So as Jackie mentioned, you're trying to do 10 counts of different areas of the field within roughly an hour. So it's obviously requiring quite efficient work as a team. So I would suggest probably doing this in pairs again, and your tutor will probably decide who's doing which area. So the first sort of step to before you start doing any sampling is to work out which sample areas you're going to be using. So in every field that you do any samples, you want to do a W shape, as you can see on the screen here. So this has to be a big W, essentially taking up a large chunk of that field area. So firstly, before you actually go out in the field, it'd be useful to map out field sort of shape and make sure you've got W ready to do that. So we would suggest using some marker points, so for example, hedgerow trees or fence posts. This obviously helps you sort of find things around the field and make sure you know where you're going. Avoid using the very edges of the fields because we sort of say minimum 5 meters from the edge. We try to avoid the edge because obviously the edge might have different agricultural things, might have water drainage, might be slightly different soil. So try and use the middle of the field as much as possible. So firstly, before you start doing any sampling as a group, put out some markers at the pits 1, 4, 6, 8 and 10. So you can see that's the sort of points of the W to help you map it out. And then you can space pits 2 and 3, even distances between 1 and 4, and then the same for 5 and 7 and 9. So basically making sure you've got a nice W with all the points and all those sort of areas roughly equidistant from each other. Assign the pits to different pairs of people. So if you're working as a group of, for example, 6, you might be doing several pits each. And write down the number of pits you're doing on the data sheets. So make sure you know who's doing which number. So pair number 1 will do pit number 1, pair number 2 does pit number 2, etc. Make sure you're very clear about which pit number you're actually doing a sample for. So just to reiterate, when we say W shape in the field, this is quite important to the methodology. So you don't want to do a square because that will mean that you completely avoid using the middle of the field, which isn't good because the middle of the field might have different structure, different density, and obviously might be farmed more intensively as well. So make sure you use the middle of the field as a full W. And likewise, don't just use the corner of the field, make sure you make use of the whole field and make a big W shape across it. Again, your tutor or researcher who's working with you should hopefully help you do this. So step 2 is to collect your kit and go to the first sample pit. So whichever pit you're doing first as a pair, obviously make sure you go there. So things you'll need, again, your university should have some of this equipment already, but things be like garden spade, so this is for digging, or a trowel, which can be like a fork. It's up to, depends what you have obviously there. You'll need 3 pots with a lid, make sure you've got the place to put the worms into them. A ruler, so you know how deep the pits are, a plastic sheet or tray, so you can use that for sorting the worms. Stopwatch or clock for timing to make sure you don't spend half an hour per pit. You want to do roughly 5–10 minutes per pit to make it quite efficient. ID materials methodology sheet with you, so obviously you can refer to that. Water for rinsing the worms for any ID. A record sheet, waterproof clipboard, and pen and pencils. Again, I believe this equipment should all be there on hand on the day when you get there, hopefully. So remember to record the data for each sample pit that you do on a separate data sheet. So each sample pit will have its own individual sheet. So firstly, record the date and time of the survey. So obviously the date, what time of day it is, field number or name. So if you're starting in field 1 or it has a name, obviously make sure you write that down. Check the weather as well. So make sure you add some details about this. Field details, again, it's really useful for us to know, is the field normally got crops in it? Has it got any permanent pasture for grazing? Essentially, what is the field used for, basically? You can also put on there any sort of surrounding features like hedges, fences, or other things. So firstly, put your sample pit number first. So fill in the sample pit number. So if you're doing pit number 3, you'd obviously put number 3. Make sure you put a GPS reference of that specific sample point. You have to take a GPS reference of every point on that field. Total number of earthworms that you've counted. So that's all the worms you've counted in total. Number of adults total, which is the ones with the saddle. If you remember from the video, it's the worms that have like a little red saddle on the back. I'll show you a photo soon. Juveniles, which means young worms, they have no saddle, so count the number of those as well. Temperature of the surface of the air, because that's important as well, and then soil temperature at 5 centimeters depth as well. So you'll be measuring temperature as well as you go along, as well as things like GPS points and number of worms. So first, take a GPS reading and make sure you record it on the data sheet for your point. So you can record the 2-letter 10-digit GPS coordinates of your sample pit out in the field. We suggest having a GPS mapping feature on an app on your phone to do this. Again, I think this will be sent out information before the field trip, but essentially having that on your phone is really helpful so we can actually see which point of the field you're in. So you'd record that first. Secondly, then dig your soil pit. So obviously you want to create a nice block of soil to take the worms out, roughly 30 centimeters around, so roughly square, 30 centimeters hole that you want to do, 20 centimeters deep. So you can use a fork if you have a fork. If you don't have a fork, obviously you're welcome to use a spade. It depends obviously what your tutor's brought along with you for the day. So although we said you're digging soil pits, we really want you to make a bit of a block, take out the block, and then obviously count what worms are in there. So the block or pit will need to be down to 20 centimeters depth, needs to be 30 times 30 centimeters wide. So use a ruler to check the width and depth before you start digging if possible. Once you've got this pit ready, lift the soil block out of the ground and place it on the plastic sheet. You can then hand sort it afterwards. So next step is to pick out any earthworms from that soil block on that sheet. So make sure you essentially crumble the soil with your hands. Obviously you can wear gloves if you want to. Make sure you sort through and then pick out any worms that you do find gently into the box. So break up the soil block gently by hand, teasing out any earthworms from roots and soil clumps and separating them out. It's also important to make sure you carefully tease apart dense root mats because often any sort of root areas of plants, the earthworms will be in there. So make sure you sort of tease those out, make sure you get any worms out there. Place any worms you find into one pot initially. Just a little note on animal welfare. So please do take care of the earthworms. Earthworms like cool, dark and damp places. So they do not like being out in sunlight. They're not a fan of being out in the open. So please do shade them if it's a sunny, hot day. Make sure you put them somewhere shaded if possible. They also can't get too dry, so their skin needs to be quite wet for them to breathe. So if it's a hot, again, dry day, definitely put a tiny bit of water potentially into that pot, just a tiny bit to keep them moist. You don't want to have them swimming, it's just a little bit of spray to give them a bit of moisture. Also, don't press the lids down fully so the air can still get into the pot so they can breathe. So make sure that you sort of do all this just for a bit of welfare, because obviously worms are super important. You don't want to kill them as part of the study. So next step, once you've got all your worms in one pot that you've sorted through, is to decide now which ones are juveniles and which ones are adults. So take the earthworms out gently one at a time, handle them quite gently because their skin is sensitive, and choose one pot for adults and one for juveniles. So separate into 2 different pots, the juveniles and adults. So what you're looking for is the saddle called the clitellum, which as you can see on the screen here circled. This tells you if the adult is juvenile, if it's an adult or a juvenile, essentially. So adult worms have this saddle, juvenile worms don't have it. So you can separate adult and juvenile that way. And you can see on the top right of the slides, there's a picture there of the adult one with the clear white saddle, and then the juvenile below it with no saddle. So that's how you know if it's a juvenile or adult worm. So once you've got them separated, make sure you've got adults in one pot with the saddle and juveniles in the other pot with no saddle, and record the total number of worms and all together, and also separate the adults and separate juveniles on that sheet. You'll also be asked to measure soil temperature. So this is the next step to make sure you take the soil temperature next to the soil pit, somewhere quite close to it. Insert the probe 5 centimeters deep into undisturbed soil next to your soil pit, and record the temperature on the data collection sheet. This will tell you what the temperature is roughly 5 centimeters down in the soil. So make sure you record this as well. Once you're finished with all this, you can then put the earthworms gently back into the hole and then gently replace the soil back in that pit and dig it back down. So essentially make sure you leave things roughly how as you found them. Obviously, you'll disturb the ground, make sure you put it all back in there with the worms as well. That means you've then finished your first pit. So once you finish that, make sure you record any other details on that pit. So for example, weather, any other details about that area, and you can move on to then doing the next pit that you're doing. So if you're doing several pits in pairs, obviously you'd finish one pit at a time and then move on to the next point that your group is doing. So make sure you repeat the steps again of getting the coordinates, digging out your pit. Make sure you hand sort the earthworms gently on the sheet, put them into separate pots for adults and juveniles, and then take the air temperature and replace them all back in there. So hopefully that all makes sense. You're going to get the sheet with all the instructions anyway, so don't worry too much if you can't remember it all, but hopefully that gives you an idea of what's going to be happening. Make sure you fill the data as you go along. So online, we do have like a record sheet on Excel, which is preferred. This just means that you can record out in the field already onto a data sheet. If not, you can do it on paper. Make sure someone types it up afterwards, as this will need to be entered at the end of the day. So if you want to save yourself some time, using a spreadsheet on your phone might be quicker. Otherwise, you can use the paper sheet and then type it up afterwards. So does that all make sense? Any questions about the earthworm surveying, or is that all clear enough, hopefully? I'll give you all a second. If you want to put any questions in the chat box, let me know. Well, hopefully that was clear enough. The video, as I said, is really helpful just to show how to do it. And you will have all the instructions on the sheet on the day as well. Cool, so move on then. We do have some further reading and resources. So again, if anyone's particularly interested in earthworms, I recommend checking out Jackie Stroud. She does have some really cool stuff about earthworms. There's lots of papers here on the screen. And Hafiza asked, do we need to bring equipment as discussed? Jacqueline, I think, correct me, but I think all the equipment should already be there with your person leading the field trip, I think. So I don't think.
Yeah, sorry, to the best of my knowledge, that is the case. But I will follow that up just in case for everybody. So when we send out this recording later, I will also make sure that I've got that answer for you there. And yes, the question about can we have the recordings? Yes, you can. They will be sent out and made available to everyone after today.
Perfect. So yeah, I think from what I remember from last year, students just turn up with their right, so make sure you got good shoes on and stuff, and make sure you got a bag with food and I think some water. But essentially all the equipment, I believe, should already be there on site when you arrive, or with your tutor who brings it. So I think you're okay in terms of equipment. Perfect. So the very last survey method we're going to look at is mammals, which is an optional one. So I don't know if Lincoln will opt to do it, but obviously if you have time on the day and you have a chance to do some mammal surveying, that is a nice thing to do as well if possible. So again, a final question for me for the chat box is just to have a little think and then type any ideas. So why do you think we record signs of mammals? So things like droppings, burrows and footprints, as well as sightings of mammals. Any ideas of why we do this? So for most species of animal, we tend to try and record direct sightings. Of mammals, we tend to be more lenient and we record any signs of mammals as well. So any ideas why? I'll let you put in the chat box. Yep, so if you put out to figure out the location, how is that? Yep. So the main reason we tend to record other things for mammals is because mammals are quite difficult to see, essentially. So they're quite hard to record because it's quite hard to find them. A lot of mammals are nocturnal, which means they're only active at nighttime. So things like badgers, foxes, a lot of these sort of species are active only at nighttime, hedgehogs as well, which makes it really hard to see them. So obviously, if you're going to go out to your farm visit, you know, for a lunchtime, afternoon time, you're not likely to see that many mammals because it's daytime. So this is the reason that for mammal surveying, we encourage people to record any droppings, any burrows, footprints, or other field signs they might find of mammals, because they're quite hard to spot. And as Hafiza mentioned, it helps to figure out location and presence of mammals on that farm. So for mammals, because it's an optional survey, we tend to just use something, a Mammal Mapper app. So this is essentially an app developed by Mammal Society. It's really helpful. It essentially helps you record sightings and signs of mammals on the farm. You can also use it in day-to-day life. So for example, if you are out on campus or out in your local area and you spot a mammal, you can absolutely record any mammal sightings you find or anything you see on this app, and it contributes to national research. I definitely encourage you to use the app. In general, it's really nice, quite handy, and quite a fun one to get to know what mammals are in your area. So I'll now show you how to actually use it. We've got a little video again, but I think as before, it's not going to want to play. So I will have to come off my screen share and then share it separately. Again, bear with me. Building. The advert play through and I get it screen shared. There we go. So I will play this from the start. And essentially, this will just show you a little bit how to use the app. As I said, you can use it in general life. You don't have to just use it for the project. It's quite a fun, handy app you can download on your phone. So if you're interested in mammal behavior or mammal recording, I definitely recommend using this.
Most wild mammals, from rabbits to iconic species like hedgehogs and mountain hares, are very poorly monitored. This makes it difficult to detect changes in their ranges and population sizes. However, you can help the Mammal Society by recording any mammals you see in the UK on their Mammal Mapper app. Mammal Mapper is a free, easy-to-use app that enables you to record mammals when and where you see them in the UK. Reports can be of mammals themselves or of signs of mammals such as tracks, fur and burrows. The app can be used to record mammals along a route, for example whilst out walking, running, cycling, or even as a passenger in a car. Or to record mammals as one-off sightings, like a hedgehog in your garden. So how do you use the app? From the home screen, you can either start survey to record mammals along a route, or report a sighting for one-off sightings. Simply open the app and click Start Survey. The app will then retrieve your location, date and time. Choose your mode of transport and enter a survey ID if you're taking part in an organised survey. Once you've clicked Start, the app will start tracking your journey, and at this point you can even put your device away. When you do see a mammal or sign of a mammal, just click Add Sighting. From here, the app will walk you through the information you need to enter. You can choose to submit a photo if you're able to take one, and then choose the species and how you saw it. One of the great features of the app is its handy ID guide, which contains photos of each mammal and the signs they leave behind, as well as short descriptions and their distributions, so you can learn more about the mammals we share the UK with. If you come across something that you can't identify while using the app, you can still add it to the survey, preferably with a photo if you can, so that the Mammal Society's expert verifiers can look at the record to identify it for you. Once you've finished, simply submit the survey and the recordings will go straight to the Mammal Society. And don't worry if you never see mammals. Submitting surveys where you haven't seen anything is just as important. If we know where people are looking for mammals, then we can find out where animals are absent, as well as where they are present. Download the app from either Google Play or the App Store and start turning your everyday activities into fun science surveys.
stop sharing there. But as I said, I recommend using it. I use it sometimes for walks in the evening, or if you just generally see mammals, that's quite useful to record things there. But obviously for the purposes of FCN, we also encourage you to use it. So if you do see any mammals out and about when you're actually on the farm, it is really helpful to make sure you record that as well. So if you have time of the day, you could potentially do a little transect walk where you go across a section of the farm and record any mammals you see or any signs. Or as and when you spot a mammal, so for example, you see a fox or a deer, you could potentially record it separately as well. So first step is download the Mammal Mapper app if you want to use this. So this is free on the App Store for Android and iPhone. You can use it, as I said, in general and also for the specific farm survey. It's been developed by Mammal Society to help them collect data, as they mentioned in the video, because mammals are very much under-recorded. So this is really helpful data for them to actually get an idea of mammal populations across the UK. So again, work with your tutor to choose the route if you're going to do a transect walk, which means walking across the farm. So good places to start to do a transect walk is a stretch of hedgerow. So ideally not along a main footpath, as you want to avoid having dog prints or lots of human activity. A good place could be to also wooded areas, so somewhere that's got forests or sort of trees along it, following a river or stream, because all animals need to drink. They often come to the river or stream, or a field margin perimeters along the edge of a field. So look out for gaps in cover and hedgerow openings, as well as signs of tracks and tunnels. Look for burrows. And muddy ground is really great for having sort of places that you can find prints from animals. So you might like to see some deer prints, for example, or fox prints. So do look out in muddy ground as well, because it is really helpful to actually see those paw prints in there. So a few ideas there of where you could start. So as we mentioned, sort of edges, sort of go away from footpaths, wooded areas, a river or stream or field edge is best. So to use Mammal Mapper to conduct and record a survey, firstly, click Start Survey. So this will let you do a sort of survey for a certain amount of time. So click that button. Add our survey ID. This is very key because if you don't put FCN into that little bit, we can't actually see your results. So make sure you put FCN into your survey ID. And this means that then we can actually ask Mammal Society to send us any records that you've uploaded. So make sure you put FCN if you're doing this on a farm visit to make sure we can actually get that data from the farm. So please type in that into that survey ID bit, as this is a unique identifier for our project, so we can collect the data afterwards. Recordings of mammals can be made of the animal themselves. So if you actually see the mammal, so for example, if you've seen a roe deer, you can record that as mammal spotted, or you can actually record any signs you see, so prints and trails, droppings, den burrows, or something you've heard. So again, depending on what you've seen, make sure you select the right button on the app. You can use the app to help you ID tracks and signs, and also an FSC field guide that's provided to the university as well. So if you want to have a look at different footprints or different signs, there are some really handy guides, both on paper and also online you can have a look for. And the app will also help you give some ID suggestions. So as I said, because mammals are quite hard to spot and are quite shy and nocturnal, we often record other sightings of them. So things like burrows they've left behind, or footprints or bits of fur, maybe something that's been eaten. That's often easier to actually see than the actual mammal itself. Keep adding sightings during walks. So this will be added to your survey automatically. Once you're finished with your survey, click Finish. And you'll be asked if you're sure that you have finished. So if you have, obviously make sure you click that. So some further readings and resources, as I said, you can also just use this app in general life. Obviously don't put FCN if you're using it in your garden. The FCN bit is only if you're actually going to use it on the farm. So make sure you do add that identifier in if you're going to use it as part of the field trip to the farm. Cool, I think that's all our training done. So do we have any questions in terms of any of the survey methods so far, or anything that's not quite clear? Any other questions? You can unmute yourself or just type in the chat box if you have any questions.
That's right. If I may, I did just follow up about the equipment. So no, you're not required to bring anything. But again, just please be sure to wear, a good pair of shoes for being on a farm. Make sure you bring like a water bottle, things like that. But in terms of things like binoculars, no, you do not need to provide those yourself.
Thanks, Jacqueline. So yeah, all the equipment should be there. So for anyone doing obviously the bird and mammal surveys, that should all be, just turn up, make sure your phone's potentially charged, wearing some comfy footwear and obviously some layers, and then having water and food, I think is the only stuff you really need. So
And sunscreen.
Oh, and sunscreen, yes. If you're going out on a hot day, actually, in the next few months, definitely recommend that too. Perfect. So we've got a few little accreditations on our slide here. So a few thank yous to some of our people who contributed to these slides. So we've got on the screen here. So we've essentially the project's been running as a pilot since last year. So this is our second year running this project with all the support of these people. And finally, we've just got a little activity to do finally before you go. It's just to give us a bit of feedback. So if you could just all scan the QR code onto your phone, or you can go onto slido.com and put the number 2768689. Either way, if you could just access this and just give us literally 2 minutes of your time just to give us a bit of feedback, and then we can finish up the survey today. I'll keep this on screen for all of you just to make sure you can access it. And if anyone's got any questions as well, in the meantime, make sure you put in the chat box any questions or anything you're not sure about. We finished nice and early as well, so before 12, so you've got a bit of time back, which is great for everyone, hopefully. But yeah, if there's anything unclear or you're not quite sure about any of the slides, when you actually get to do the surveys, hopefully your tutor or anyone on hand all day will be able to help out with any questions. And obviously you can email the food and farming inbox as well to ask any questions you're not sure about. Cool, so I'll come off this now, and if you can all just carry on obviously filling in the survey if you're still working on it. Great, thanks, Fiza. Perfect, so we're all wrapped up for today. It's been lovely to have you all on the call today. So thank you so much for joining. We hope that the survey goes really well, that you learn some new skills, and obviously that you enjoy recording some wildlife out on the farms. So thanks so much, everyone. Take care and have a good day. We had a question about, are we meeting at any location, or do we find our way to the location?